Whenever a spurred boot thudded heavily against the floorboards, Abigail braced herself for the pain she knew would follow. 3 years of bruises painted her skin, her spirit utterly crushed under a cruel man's fist. She thought she would die in that dusty cabin until a stranger's shadow fell across the broken doorway. The Texas sun showed no mercy to the town of Oakmere, and neither did its people. For Abigail Miller, the glaring heat of 1,886 was nothing compared to the burning shame she endured every time she walked down the wooden boardwalks. Abigail was a large woman. She carried heavy weight on her frame, a softness that the hardened, dusty folks of the frontier viewed with quiet mockery. Her arms were thick, her waist broad, and her face round, framed by limp, sweat-dampened brown hair. In a town where survival usually wore folks down to bone and gristle, Abigail's size made her an anomaly, a target for cruel whispers behind cupped hands. But the cruelty of the town was a gentle breeze compared to the hurricane of violence waiting for her at home. 3 years ago, Abigail had been a grieving daughter. Her father, a hard-working man named Thomas Miller, had passed away from a sudden fever, leaving Abigail the sole inheritor of a sprawling piece of grazing land and a moderately successful mercantile. She was 22, utterly alone, and deeply vulnerable. That was when Jedediah Cooper stepped in. Jed was a handsome, silver-tongued opportunist with a quick smile and a dark, hollow heart. He saw not a woman in mourning, but a gold mine wrapped in a package he believed he could easily control. He whispered sweet words in the dark, told her that her curves were beautiful, and promised her that she would never have to be alone again. Desperate for love and terrified of managing her father's estate by herself, Abigail said yes. They were married within a month. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry when the first blow landed. It started with a slap across the face when she accidentally burned the morning biscuits. The shock had frozen her, leaving her staring at him in disbelief as the sting bloomed across her cheek. Jed had immediately apologized, weeping, blaming his temper and the stress of taking over the mercantile. But the apologies soon stopped, and the beatings became a terrifying routine. Jed stripped her of everything. He sold off her father's cattle to pay his gambling debts at the local saloon. He drained the mercantile's accounts. And worse, he systematically destroyed her mind. He weaponized her body against her, knowing exactly where to plant the psychological knives. "Look at you," Jed sneered one evening, his words slurring from the cheap rye whiskey he constantly drank. He stood in the center of their modest kitchen, swaying slightly. "You're a fat, useless cow. You think anyone else would want you? You're lucky I stepped in. If it weren't for me, you'd be begging in the dirt, you pathetic hog." Abigail stood silently by the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of beans, tears silently tracking down her flushed, bruised cheeks. She had learned the hard way that answering back only earned her a closed fist. Her body was a roadmap of his rage. A yellowing bruise on her jawline from Tuesday, a split lip from Friday, deep purple finger marks wrapping around her thick upper arms where he had dragged her across the floor. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional torment was a slow, agonizing death. Jed made sure she believed she was worthless. He made sure she believed that her weight made her repulsive, unlovable, and entirely dependent on his charity. The town of Oakmere turned a blind eye. Sheriff Amos Higgins was a regular drinking buddy of Jed's, and whenever Abigail tried to seek help, Amos would tip his hat and say, "Now, Miss Abigail, what goes on under a man's roof is between him and the Almighty. You just need to be a more obedient wife." Even Doc Henderson, who stitched up a nasty cut above her eyebrow when Jed threw a glass lantern at her head, merely averted his eyes and advised her to try not to provoke him. Abigail was entirely trapped in a prison of her own home. She shrank inward, her bright, kind spirit buried under layers of terror and self-hatred. She stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary. She stopped singing while she hung the laundry. She simply existed, bracing herself for the next explosion. The worst incident happened in the dead of winter, during their 3rd year of marriage. Jed had lost heavily at a poker game. He came bursting through the door, the freezing wind howling behind him. Abigail was asleep in the chair by the dying fire. He didn't say a word. He grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and struck her across the ribs. The sickening crack echoed in the small cabin. For 3 weeks, Abigail couldn't breathe without blinding agony. She dragged her heavy body around the house, tending to his needs, terrified that if she stopped moving, he would kill her. She prayed for death every night. She prayed that her heart would just stop beating in her sleep. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that she would die on the blood-stained floorboards of that cabin, remembered only as Jed Cooper's fat, clumsy wife. Spring came to Oakmere, bringing a brief respite of blooming wildflowers before the suffocating summer heat returned. Abigail was working at the Mercantile. Jed forced her to run the counter while he slept off his hangovers or played cards. The store was her only sanctuary, a place where she could organize tins of peaches and fold bolts of calico cloth, finding brief moments of peace in the mundane tasks. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing through the dirty front windows. Abigail was behind the wooden counter, her right eye swollen shut, a vibrant shade of plum and yellow. Jed had been angry that his boots weren't polished to his liking that morning. The bell above the door jingled. Abigail flinched, her heavy shoulders instantly rising toward her ears as she braced for whoever was walking in. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the ledger in front of her. Heavy boots stepped onto the floorboards. The rhythmic clink-clank of silver spurs echoed through the quiet store. The steps were slow, deliberate, and entirely unfamiliar. "Afternoon, ma'am." The voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like distant thunder rolling over the plains. It wasn't the sharp, demanding tone of the local ranchers, nor the drunken slur of Jed's friends. It was steady, respectful. Abigail slowly looked up, her good eye widening slightly. Standing on the other side of the counter was a man who looked like he had ridden straight out of a prairie storm. He was tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the sunlight from the window. A layer of pale dust coated his dark duster coat and his wide-brimmed Stetson. Beneath the brim of the hat, piercing storm-gray eyes locked onto hers. He had a strong, square jaw covered in a few days of dark stubble, and a white scar cut a jagged path through his left eyebrow. A heavy Colt .45 rested comfortably on his right hip, the holster worn smooth from use. He didn't look at her heavy figure with the usual disdain. He didn't smirk or look away in disgust. Instead, his gray eyes immediately snapped to the swollen purple mass around her right eye. A flash of something dark and dangerous flickered in his gaze, but his face remained a mask of calm. "I'm in need of some provisions," the stranger said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Coffee, some salted pork, and a few boxes of Winchester rounds, if you carry 'em." Abigail swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, sir, we have those." Her voice was a raspy whisper, rusty from lack of use. She turned, her heavy body moving slowly, still aching from the morning's abuse. She reached up to a high shelf to grab the coffee tins. As she stretched, her sleeve slid down, revealing the dark, finger-shaped bruises wrapping around her thick forearm. She quickly yanked the sleeve back down, her face flushing bright red with shame. She placed the items on the counter, keeping her eyes downcast. That'll be $2.40, please." The stranger reached into his pocket, pulling out 3 silver dollars. He placed them gently on the counter. "Keep the change, ma'am." "Oh, no, I couldn't," Abigail stammered, instinctively reaching for the coins to make change. Before her hand could touch the silver, the front door of the Mercantile crashed open, the glass pane rattling violently. Jed stormed in, his face flushed with rage and cheap liquor. "Abigail!" he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the wooden walls. "Where is the money from the Henderson account? I know he paid yesterday." Abigail froze, terror instantly paralyzing her. "Jed, please, we have a customer." "I don't care about no damn customer," Jed sneered, marching toward the counter. He didn't even glance at the stranger. He reached across the wooden barrier and grabbed a fistful of the collar of Abigail's dress, yanking her forward. "You hiding money from me, you fat cow? I'll beat the truth out of you right here." Abigail whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the fist to connect with her face. The blow never came. Instead, a sound sliced through the heavy tension in the room. It was sharp, metallic, and utterly terrifying. Click-clack. Jed froze. The color instantly drained from his flushed face. Abigail opened her good eye. The stranger hadn't shouted. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply drawn his Colt .45 with a speed that defied logic. The heavy barrel was pressed directly against Jed Cooper's right temple. The hammer was cocked back. "Take your hand off the lady," the stranger said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a deadly, quiet whisper. It was the sound of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do it again. Jed slowly released Abigail's collar, holding his hands up in surrender, trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Now hold on, mister. This ain't your business. This is my wife," I said. "Step back." The stranger pressed the barrel harder, forcing Jed to stumble backward. The stranger slowly holstered his weapon, his cold gray eyes never leaving Jed's terrified face. "My name is Wyatt Hayes, and I don't care if she's your wife, your sister, or the Queen of England. If I ever see you lay a hand on her again, or if I hear you speak to her with anything less than absolute respect, I will shoot you where you stand. Do we have an understanding?" Jed swallowed loudly. His bravado entirely vanished. He nodded frantically. "Yes. Yes, sir." "Get out," Wyatt commanded. Jed turned and scrambled out the door, nearly tripping over his own boots in his haste to escape. The silence that fell over the mercantile was deafening. Abigail stood trembling behind the counter, clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was waiting for the stranger to turn his gun on her, to demand the money in the till. That was how men worked in her world. Violence always had a price. Instead, Wyatt Hayes turned to her, his hard expression softening entirely. He reached up and slowly took off his Stetson, holding it over his chest. "I apologize for the disturbance, ma'am," Wyatt said gently, his eyes filled with a deep, unexpected sadness as he looked at her bruised face. "Are you all right?" Abigail stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her cheeks. No man had ever asked if she was all right. No man had ever called her a lady. I. She couldn't speak. A sob tore through her throat, shaking her large frame. Wyatt stepped up to the counter. He didn't reach for her, respecting her space, but he looked at her with a profound, quiet sincerity. "A man who raises a hand to a woman is no man at all," Wyatt said softly. "You don't deserve to be treated that way. Nobody does." Abigail looked at the stranger, this Wyatt Hayes, and for the first time in 3 agonizing years, a tiny, fragile spark of hope flickered in the suffocating darkness of her life. The cowboy hadn't just walked through the door. He had just drawn a line in the sand of her hell. But as she looked toward the open door where Jed had fled, she knew her husband. Jed Cooper was a coward, but he was a vengeful one. This wasn't the end of the violence. It was only the beginning of a war. The days following Wyatt Hayes' intervention at the mercantile were the quietest Abigail had experienced in 3 years. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness that precedes a devastating prairie tornado. Jed did not hit her. He barely spoke to her. He spent his days drinking heavily at the local saloon and his nights pacing the wooden floors of their cabin, his boots thudding in a frantic, erratic rhythm. His bruised ego was a festering wound. Wyatt had humiliated him in front of his wife, stripping away the illusion of absolute power he had so carefully constructed. and a coward stripped of his power is the most dangerous creature on God's earth. Wyatt Hayes, meanwhile, did not leave Oakmere. He set up a modest camp just outside the town limits, near a bend in the Brazos River. Every afternoon, like clockwork, he rode his dark, roan horse into town and tied it outside the mercantile. He never bought much, a handful of nails, a tin of tobacco, a single apple, but his presence was a heavy protective shield. He would tip his wide-brimmed Stetson, offer a polite afternoon, Miss Abigail, and stand near the window, his storm-gray eyes scanning the dusty street. During these quiet visits they began to speak. At first it was just the weather and the price of grain, but slowly the thick ice around Abigail's heart began to thaw. She learned that Wyatt was not just a drifting cowboy. "I was a Texas Ranger," Wyatt confessed one rainy Tuesday, leaning against the counter while the storm lashed against the glass. He kept his voice low, his gaze fixed on the water pooling in the street. "Served down near the border under Captain John R. Hughes. Seen a lot of bad men do a lot of bad things." Abigail paused, her hands resting on a bolt of blue cotton. "Why did you leave?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. The white scar through his eyebrow seemed to starkly contrast his dark, stubbled skin. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small, faded, tintype photograph, sliding it across the wooden counter. It was a picture of a young woman with a bright smile, her features undeniably similar to Wyatt's. "Her name was Sarah," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a haunting grief. "My younger sister. She married a man out in El Paso. A respectable man, everyone said. A banker. But behind closed doors, he had a temper. And heavy hands." Abigail's breath hitched. She looked down at her own bruised knuckles, understanding instantly. "I was out hunting rustlers," Wyatt continued, staring past Abigail into a terrible memory. "I didn't know. She hid it, just like he made her hide it. By the time a neighbor sent word that she was in trouble, I rode 3 days without sleep to get to her. I was too late. He beat her to death over a burnt supper." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. "Oh, Wyatt, I am so deeply sorry." "I found him," Wyatt said, his tone turning to absolice. "And I made sure he would never hurt another living soul. But it didn't bring her back. I turned in my ranger badge the next morning. I couldn't protect the one person who mattered most. When I walked into this store and saw your face, I saw Sarah. I made a vow on her grave. I'd never walk away from a woman in danger again." The revelation shifted something profound within Abigail. Wyatt wasn't pitying her because she was large, or clumsy, or broken. He was seeing her as a human being worthy of the protection his sister was denied. For 3 years, Jed had convinced her that her thick body made her a monster, unworthy of love or defense. Wyatt's respect was a mirror reflecting a truth she had forgotten. She was Thomas Miller's daughter. She was strong. She had survived. But while hope was blooming in the mercantile, venom was brewing in the saloon. Jed had finally hatched a plan. He knew he couldn't take Wyatt in a fair fight. He needed the law on his side. He poured out his coin purse on Sheriff Amos Higgins's desk late one night. "The stranger is a wanted man," Jed lied smoothly, pushing a stack of silver dollars toward the corrupt lawman. "I saw his face on a bounty poster down in San Antonio. He's planning to rob the bank, Amos. And, he's using my wife's store to case the town. We need to run him out, or better yet, put him in the dirt where he belongs." Amos Higgins pocketed the silver, his greedy eyes gleaming. "A preemptive strike, you say? Protecting the good citizens of Oakmere? I can deputize a few of the boys. We'll ride out to his camp tonight. A man resisting arrest. Well, accidents happen in the dark." Jed smiled, a sickening, yellow-toothed grin. "And while you take care of the drifter, I have a final lesson to teach my disobedient wife." The night air was thick and oppressive, carrying the unmistakable scent of a coming thunderstorm. Abigail lay awake in the dark cabin, listening to the heavy silence. Jed was not home. He had left hours ago, taking his rifle and a heavy coil of rope. An uneasy feeling gnawed at her stomach. She crept out of bed and wrapped a thick shawl over her nightgown. She walked into the kitchen and noticed something missing. The large tin of kerosene, usually kept by the back door for the lanterns, was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She remembered the hushed, drunken whispers she had heard between Jed and Amos days earlier about taking care of the stray dog. They are going after Wyatt. For 3 years, Abigail's instinct had been to hide, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. But as she stood in the dark kitchen, thinking of the man who had treated her like a lady, who carried the ghost of his sister in his eyes, a new emotion ignited within her. Rage. She would not let another good person die because of Jedediah Cooper. Abigail threw on her heavy boots, not bothering to lace them up properly, and rushed out the back door. She knew the shortcut to the river bend, a treacherous, rocky path through the mesquite brush. Her large frame pushed through the thorny branches, tearing her nightgown and scratching her arms. But she didn't feel the pain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a war drum. She reached the ridge overlooking the river just as the moon broke through the clouds. Below, she saw Wyatt's dying campfire. And creeping through the tall grass toward the camp were 4 men, armed with rifles. She recognized the glint of the badge on Amos Higgins's chest. "Wyatt!" Abigail screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet night with the force of a thunderclap. "Ambush! Wyatt! Wake up!" Down in the camp, the dark shape of Wyatt's bedroll suddenly exploded into motion. He hadn't been asleep. A seasoned ranger never slept fully. Gunfire erupted. The crack of rifles shattered the night as the deputies opened fire on the camp. But Wyatt was a ghost in the shadows. His Colt, .45, answered with lethal precision. Bang, bang. 2 deputies dropped their rifles, howling in pain as bullets shattered their shoulders. Sheriff Amos cursed, turning his weapon toward the ridge where Abigail had shouted. But before he could fire, Wyatt's voice rang out from behind an oak tree. "Drop it, Amos. You're outgunned and out of your jurisdiction." While the chaotic gunfight unfolded below, Abigail felt a sudden, terrifying jerk on her hair. She was yanked backward, crashing onto the hard dirt. Jed was standing over her, his face twisted into a mask of pure, demonic fury. He held the kerosene tin in one hand and a lit lantern in the other. "You stupid fat sow," Jed spat, kicking her hard in the ribs. Abigail gasped, the old pain flaring up brilliantly. "I knew you'd come crawling to warn him. You ruined everything. I was going to burn you in the cabin. Tell the town it was a tragic accident, and take your father's money to California. Now, I'll just have to burn you out here." He splashed the kerosene over the dry grass surrounding her, the sharp chemical smell burning her nose. "Jed, don't do this," Abigail pleaded, trying to scramble backward, but her heavy dress caught on the thorny brush. "Nobody wants you, Abigail! You're nothing!" Jed screamed, raising the lantern to smash it onto the soaked earth. In that fraction of a second, Abigail realized the absolute truth. Wyatt had saved her in the store, but Wyatt could not save her now. He was pinned down by the sheriff. If she wanted to live, if she wanted to be free of this nightmare, she had to save herself. Jed thought her weight was her weakness. He thought it made her clumsy and pathetic. But Abigail knew the truth of her own body. She possessed strength. He couldn't fathom the strength of carrying burdens, the sheer, unstoppable mass of a woman pushed entirely past her breaking point. As Jed brought the lantern down, Abigail roared. She didn't cower. She lunged forward, throwing her entire body weight directly into his legs. The impact was like a runaway freight train hitting a wooden fence. Jed let out a shocked yelp as his legs were swept out from under him. He crashed backward onto the rocky ground. The lantern flew from his hand, shattering on a boulder a dozen yards away, harmlessly igniting a small patch of dirt rather than the kerosene-soaked grass. Jed scrambled frantically, trying to reach his belt knife, but Abigail didn't give him the chance. She hauled herself up and fell heavily onto his chest, pinning his arms to the ground beneath her knees. He thrashed and bucked, his face turning purple, but he couldn't move her. For the first time in his miserable life, Jedediah Cooper was entirely powerless. "You are nothing," Abigail gritted out, her hands wrapping tightly around his collar. She raised her right fist, the fist of a woman who hauled 100-pound grain sacks every single day, and brought it down squarely across his jaw. The satisfying crack echoed loudly. Jed's eyes rolled back, and his body went entirely limp beneath her. Abigail sat there in the dirt, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly draining from her veins. She looked down at the unconscious man who had terrorized her for 3 years. He looked so small, so utterly pathetic. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. She turned, her breath catching. Wyatt stepped into the moonlight, his gun smoking in his hand. He had disarmed the sheriff and tied him up with the deputies. He looked at the unconscious Jed, then down at Abigail, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound admiration. He offered his hand. Abigail looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her bruised hand in his, and he effortlessly pulled her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" Wyatt asked, softly. Abigail wiped a smear of dirt from her cheek, standing tall, her shoulders squared. "No," she said, her voice steady and clear. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel perfectly fine." The sunrise over Oakmere the next morning brought a permanent change to the dusty town. A federal marshal, an old friend of Wyatt's from his ranger days, arrived by noon. Sheriff Amos Higgins and his deputies were arrested for corruption and attempted murder. Jedediah Cooper woke up in a heavy iron cell. When the marshal read off his charges, which included a long list of financial frauds Wyatt had uncovered in the mercantile ledgers, Jed wept like a child, begging Abigail for mercy through the bars. Abigail stood in front of the cell, wearing her best Sunday dress, her head held high. She didn't say a single word to him. She just turned her back and walked out into the bright Texas sun. Abigail reclaimed her life. She filed for a legal separation and took full control of her father's land and the mercantile. She painted the storefront a bright, cheerful yellow. She stopped hiding her body and started laughing loudly with the customers. The townspeople, who had once whispered about her, now tipped their hats in genuine respect. They had seen what happened to the men who crossed her. Wyatt Hayes didn't ride away. He bought a small parcel of land adjacent to Abigail's property and started a modest horse ranch. He became a fixture in her life, a steady, quiet presence. He never rushed her, never demanded anything of her. He simply stood by her side as an equal. Years later, on a cool autumn evening, Abigail and Wyatt sat on the porch of her rebuilt farmhouse. The scars of the past had faded, replaced by the deep, comfortable lines of a life well lived. Wyatt reached over, his calloused hand gently covering hers. Abigail smiled, her heart full. She had survived the fires of hell, not just because a cowboy walked through the door, but because she had finally learned how to fight for herself. Abigail's journey from a broken, abused wife to a fierce, independent woman proves that true strength often hides in the places others overlook. She didn't just wait for a savior. She became her own. If her incredible story of survival, justice, and finding true love in the harsh Wild West inspired you, please hit that like button. Share Abigail's triumph with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life historical dramas.